Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Simon Nicholson. I'm Director of the Global Environmental Politics Program here in the School of International Service. I'm in the fortunate position that I get invited to give a number of these introductions. Thank you, Spencer. But this is one I've actually really looked forward to doing because this is for Judy. And Judy is amazing. That actually deserves applause, I think. Judy and I have known each other for a long time. Judy has, for much longer than I've known her, been one of the world's leading China scholars. And over the course of her last two books, she's established herself as one of the leading observers of the Chinese environmental situation and of what the environmental situation in China means for the world. Judy is also one of the dearest colleagues one can imagine having. We direct various parts of the Global Environmental Politics Program here in the school, and Judy is that program's lifeblood. I'm thrilled to have you as a colleague, Judy. Congratulations on this extraordinary achievement of a second edition of this amazing book. Before you come to speak, though, I know we'd like to have somebody else come up and say just a few words. It's my pleasure to introduce Gu Beibei, who is a student in our program who works closely with Judy. Gu Beibei is on leave from the Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs, one of the leading environmental NGOs in China. And there's nobody better, I can imagine, to say just a few words of introduction. Please. Welcome.
Good afternoon, 下午好, because I see many Asian and Chinese faces here. So I'm really glad and I feel really honored to be here to introduce Professor Judith Shapiro and her new book, the second edition of China's Environmental Challenges today. Before I start, I just wanted to read a quite interesting paragraph from one of her best-selling memoir book called The Son of the Revolution. I thought that would be an excellent introduction. So one spring day in 1979, I heard that the new American teacher in the foreign language department was scheduled to perform some dances at the art department in the college's southern campus. Her name was Xia Zhuli, which means summer bamboo beauty in Chinese, after her American name, Judith Shapiro. And she has arrived only a month before, as a result of the normalization of relations between China and the US. I went, of course, enormously curious. This was the first chance I had ever had to see one of those high-nosed, big-eyed creators in person. It seems strange to me that an English teacher could also be a dancer, for few in China had the opportunity to pursue an interest in anything beyond their own profession. So, of course, China now is vastly different, and our beloved high-nosed and big-eyed teacher is now a little bit white-haired, but of course with a lot of wisdom. So yeah, I'd like to continue my introduction. Through the initial years of living in China, Judith Shapiro has came to develop a great understanding and passion for the country that was so little known from the outside of the world, yet bearing so rich culture and historical heritage. And China later on became her major research and teaching focus. As a well-recognized China specialist, Judy has given lectures to a wide range of audience around the world, from Harvard to Beijing universities. She is also the author of multiple books on China's, including the 2001 Mouse War Against Nature, which later on inspired an award-winning environmental documentary, Waking the Green Tiger. The first edition of China's Environmental Challenge was published in 2012 amid a series of unprecedented pollution episodes that made Beijing a frequent news headlines. Investigating into the political, social, and cultural roots of China's environmental degradation, Shapiro's book has since received intensive interest from readers and researchers, both home and abroad. South China Morning Post described the book as a well-researched and balanced book about one of the great issues of our time. The newly released second edition is thoroughly updated and expanded in significant ways, including some of the focal issues such as climate change, so civil society responses, and China's global resource conquest. I'd like to just quickly read a quote from Evan Osnos, who is a staff writer of The New Yorker and the author of Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth and Faith in the New China, on Judy's new book. Judith Shapiro has given us an indispensable book, vibrant, level-headed, and up-to-minute. The new edition of her superb chronicle of China's environmental struggle encompasses both the global impact, reaching from Alberta tar sands to Kenya farms, as well as the nuanced domestic politics that will shape the future. Amid her sober accounting of today's crisis, she gives us reasons to hope that a country that can make the river flow uphill, as a Mao-era poem put it, may play a vital role in tackling climate change. I was really grateful when Judy asked me to introduce her during this important event, because personally, this is also a very important book for me. I recall that 2 years ago when I was researching my graduate school program for studying environmental policy in US, it was actually this book, of course, the first edition, that eventually brought me to study in American universities. So in Chinese, we have a word called 缘分, which means it's a relationship by fate or by destiny. So I think this is really great event, and I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Judy for this great book. And I truly hope that China's environmental challenge can be soon published and presented to the Chinese audience, whom are, like me, in much need of this book. So without further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Professor Judith Shapiro to give her speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Gu Beibei. Thank you all for being here to help me to celebrate the publication of the second edition of China's Environmental Challenges. The book is so much a product of SIS. So it's really great to be speaking about the book here in SIS. The structure of the book is all SIS. It's governance, it's identity, it's civil society, it's justice. It's all of those things that mark SIS so strongly. The book is also an intensely personal book for me. And I'd like to start with a couple of reminiscences and comparisons between the China that I saw when I first went to live there in 1979 and the more recent events. And then I'm going to present a slideshow that focuses on Chinese civil society, because we could do governance, which is a little on the boring side. We could do justice, which is incredibly depressing. But civil society is a great moment, and there's a lot going on with that, with the environment today. So when I first got to China to live in 1979, I was the only foreigner at my university, Hunan University. There were 5 cars in the entire university, and you had to be a great big fat Communist Party cadre to have the right to ride in one of them. Because I was an honored foreign expert, they decided to give me an air conditioner. And when I turned on the air conditioner, all the electricity in the university went out. I also remember in those days, in the late 70s, that some farmers started with really great fear to come to the gate of the university with a couple of heads of spinach and sell their spinach on a sort of free market for the very first time. It was a really dangerous thing to do then. How much change has happened in those 30 years? A couple years ago, I was back in Hunan Changsha for I've been there a few times, but it was the first time in a little while. And I decided to go back to my university district. I couldn't find anything I knew. All the universities had merged into one agglomeration, and it was incredibly polluted. And anyway, in sort of a sort of desperation, I decided to walk up into the mountains where I had often been, the so-called Yuelu Mountains, which are very famous. And I began to notice something strange. There were all these old men in pajamas pushing bicycles, which had great big plastic gallon jugs of water. And the guys were in pajamas because they lived up there and they were just coming out of their own homes. But I began to follow these bicycles and found the spring eventually, which people were filling their jugs from. And I began to talk to the people. Not everybody was in pajamas at that point. And I discovered that the people of Changsha had become so afraid of the possible heavy metals in their water that some of them had driven literally hours from other parts of the province to come to this mountain spring and fill up these jugs of water. It was a really dramatic kind of understanding of how deeply the Chinese people are afraid of what's in their water, what's in their air, and what's in their food. And I'll show you some slides about the food issue as part of my civil society presentation. But I think some of you know that cadmium has been discovered in the rice from Hunan. There are weird things in the tea. There's plastic products in the infant formula. And you know, when you attack a Chinese person's child's health, and when you attack their rice, and when you attack their tea, then the government's legitimacy is at stake. So arguably, China's environmental crisis is so severe that it could shape and shake the future of the country. They've done surveys, and the Chinese people are really angry about three things: really angry about the levels of pollution, really angry about the levels of corruption, really angry about the increasing inequalities in the country. And I think the Communist Party gets that, and they understand that they must do something about China's environmental crisis. So that's my prologue, and I'm going to turn now to the slideshow. And here's what I remember. This is Hunan when it was beautiful. And this is Hunan today. What are some of the drivers of this tremendous environmental change that we've experienced? Obviously, we start with population. So we can see that China's population has continued to explode. But above all, China has taken on the job of being the manufacturing hub of the world. So often when we look with great concern about the levels of pollution in China, these are really levels of pollution that belong to all of us. China has borne the brunt of what really should be our pollution. Of course, many in China have benefited from the rise of all of this manufacturing activity, and the rising middle class and the joyful consuming Chinese young person is a very unfamiliar to this day kind of image to me. I never could have dreamed 30 years ago that China would be the largest consumer of luxury goods, and of course also the largest producer of luxury knockoffs. Remember my 5 cars at my university? It's great that everybody has a car, but it's not so great that there's nowhere to go. As those of you who go to Beijing for meetings know well, often you have to decide whether to have your meeting at all based on where in the city it's going to be. The costs of China's environmental change are enormous. I particularly like this image because we can see the strength of a traditional practice of Tai Chi Chuan, against a backdrop of such intense pollution. Here are a series of images of the way China looks at almost any city on almost every day. You know, Beijing gets all the attention, but I recently, last time when I was in Hunan, I took the train from Hunan to Beijing, and the skies actually didn't clear until I got to Beijing. So it's the whole developed eastern coast. Gansu is in the interior, not much better. This is another one of those images where you can sort of see traditional culture still being practiced. There in the background is the Forbidden City. A really poignant, to my mind, image. This one is great because sometimes the Chinese government is trying to do decoration and they don't realize that they're actually showing people what it ought to be like here. A reminder to everyone that the skies should look quite different than they do. So many industrial accidents, so many chemical spills. So much poverty, so much effort to find a few plastic bottles to recycle. China is, of course, an exporter and an importer of environmental harm as the center of the e-waste industry. A lot of this e-waste is the e-waste that belongs to you and me. We claim that we're not exporting hazardous waste, but there are so many loopholes. A lot of hazardous waste does go in container ships to Hong Kong and then overland to Guiyu, where the separation of the products ends up being really harmful to the little children who are playing in it. This could go on and on. I'm promising to get to the inspirational parts, but I do want to give you a sense of the gravity of the situation. Here, just a couple years ago, 16,000 pigs were dumped in the rivers right outside of Shanghai. Those of you who know China know that Shanghai is, you know, the Paris of the Orient, and it's like a really fancy place, and the idea that you'd have 16,000 dead pigs in your water supply is pretty shocking. PX plants have been very controversial. PX is a kind of nylon product used in fabrics, and from one city to the next has fought against the PX plants, but most recently this has been a kind of death knell to PX plants. And then just even more recently, last year, in Tianjin, which is again one of the most developed cities in all of China, a chemical disposal area, chemical warehouse just exploded right in the middle of a highly populated area. So the Chinese people, I think it's fair to say, are starting to ask themselves, what is this development for? You know, it's great to have a car. It's great to have a refrigerator. We all have wristwatches now, that's for sure. But at what cost? If we can't breathe, if we can't drink, if we can't eat, you get a phenomenon, the phenomenon of naked officials. Have you all heard of naked officials? What is a naked official? That's an official who keeps their job in China but sends all of their friends and family overseas to avoid all this pollution. So, all right, so here's my slide with the words on it. I always tell my students, no slides with words. So this is my one slide with words. I'm going to talk to you today primarily about the amazing development of civil society techniques that have become available to Chinese groups. From the most conventional sort of information politics to NGO networking to a Greenpeace style of bearing witness to accountability politics where you hold a corporation or a government accountable to some promise they've made, undercover investigations, naming and shaming, a lot of symbolic politics in the theater realm, even celebrity and CEO activism, transparency politics, supply chain analysis, internet activism, and then for the ordinary people, avoiding the censors by so-called taking a walk, which does not get filtered through the internet censorships. And then environmental mass incidents, which are so common, and a kind of cutting edge area, which is public interest lawsuits. So I have slides for most of these. And I'm going to move to this. This works? Where's Tim? Okay. Make this go away. All right. So I'm going to give you a quick sort of history of the Chinese civil society environmental movement. And this is Liang Congjie in the mid-90s, because he was the grandson of Liang Qichao and the son of Liang Sicheng. So you Chinese people know what that means. Very, very, he's the offspring of some incredibly powerful, famous people. He kind of had a political backing to allow himself the courage to form the first Chinese environmental NGO, which was called Friends of Nature. And this is his antelope car. One of the very first campaigns that the Chinese NGOs embarked on was to fight against the poaching of the Tibetan antelope. The government allowed that campaign because most of the poachers were Tibetan, and the material, the chatouche, which they have a lovely soft underbelly, that mostly was smuggled through Nepal into India, woven into scarves, and sold to you and me. So that was the first campaign. And sorry, what I want to say about that campaign was that it allowed, for the first time, different NGOs in different parts of China to start to interact with each other. So even though Friends of Nature was the first formal NGO, there were lots of environmental clubs that started often under the aegis of the Communist Youth League, and they were networking with each other around the Tibetan antelope issue. So we start to have a movement. Here's another couple of environmental heroes. They were bearing witness heroes. They are a lovely, lovely couple who moved to northwest Yunnan, and they noticed that there was a tremendous amount of logging going on. He's a photographer, she's a writer, and they discovered that the logging was happening in the habitat of this adorable creature, and this is the iconic image of the Chinese environmental movement. This is the Yunnan snub-nosed monkey, very, very famous image, quite adorable. And so he was taking pictures of this Yunnan snub-nosed monkey, taking pictures of the loggers, and sending these pictures all around the world. There's a reason his nose is kind of limited, and that has to do with how cold it is there. Apparently it's better for him not to have a big nose. And since this is such a cute image, I'm going to give you another one. There's a baby one. Cute. Okay. So that's bearing witness. Accountability politics, as we know, the Chinese market for elephant ivory is decimating the African elephant population. So, but China has signed on to CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and has really, especially in Hong Kong, they've done a great deal to try to confiscate this ivory and even destroy some really ancient carvings. If you look on YouTube at some of the images, it's kind of, you know, you almost feel a little conflicted because there are really beautiful artworks carved out of ivory that are being destroyed in order to try to protect these elephants, which I'm all for, but it's interesting. So accountability politics also involves having ordinary people monitor what's being sold, and often in the form of the NGO called Traffic, which is designed specifically to support CITES. Another example of accountability politics is holding the Chinese government to account for the environmental impact law that they promised if they were going to build dams anywhere. And this is the famous Tiger Leaping Gorge. Many of you who are adventuresome people who have been in China have been to this area. You know that this is an incredibly beautiful area. There was supposed to be a dam built on this area, but fortunately some journalists and other activists argued that the EIA had not been conducted for this Tiger Leaping Gorge, and they were able to stop this particular dam. So you can still go to Tiger Leaping Gorge and see the free-flowing river. This is my favorite image that I'm going to show you. I think Simon may know why. This is a picture of my former teaching assistant, Gu Beibei knows why. This is Ma Tianjie. He graduated in the GEP program. After he graduated in GEP, he went back to be the head of Greenpeace East Asia. And he's now the chief editor of a wonderful online source called ChinaDialogue.net. So here, well, this is the way Greenpeace works, okay? They'll get telephone calls from farmers or poor people or wherever in the country, and these people will say, there's awful stuff coming out of my pipes. Please come and take a sample. And so Greenpeace will come often really at a very dangerous kind of situation, because it's almost like a thug-like mentality sometimes at the local level. They'll go, and sometimes in the middle of the night, they'll take these samples, they'll bring them back, they'll send the water sample to London and Amsterdam. And depending on what they find in there, if there's really awful chemicals, they may or may not start a campaign. And so they started a campaign that's been incredibly successful called the Detox Campaign. Here the X is the same character as the character for shui, or water. And this was a campaign that initially started to try to fight the athletic shoe industry from dumping chemicals into the Yangtze River. So they started to target, you can see in the back, Nike, Adidas, Puma, some other ones. This is a naming and shaming technique for those, IR people who like to think about, one of the questions in IR is always, does civil society matter? And if so, how does it matter? And how can we show that it actually matters? And here's a great example of how social media have allowed civil society not even to try to influence the state anymore, but to go horizontally directly to the consumer in other countries. Because if you're Nike or Puma, you do not want this out there. It expanded, the campaigns expanded to the fast fashion industry. So also, if you're Zara, you don't want this kind of image out there. And so this naming and shaming campaign was hugely successful. And almost immediately, Zara committed to stop dumping chemicals into the Yangtze River. Cool. Yes, and in fact, Gu Beibei is at the forefront of that. So we will talk about that in one moment. One of the campaigns was mostly against Apple. And we'll see that in a second. So another sort of very Western style of campaign is this sort of street theater that Greenpeace is so great at. This is also a Greenpeace campaign, but here Hewlett-Packard equals harmful products. The idea here is to not be focusing so much on the end product, those piles of e-waste, but rather to get Hewlett-Packard and other electronics manufacturers to use less toxic materials to begin with, fewer alloys, so it doesn't have to be separated with heat and air and so like that. Another example of symbolic politics, this is an example of in China, unfortunately, every law is made to be broken. Every policy is just a guideline. So we have all this wonderful protected habitat area, but then the government in Sichuan discovered, oh, look, we can get this great phosphate mine here, so let's just redraw the boundaries of the nature reserve. So you can see this really upset the panda bears. Oh, you thought this was a real panda? No, it's not a real panda. But this is street theater. Okay, so they're showing that the panda is really sad. But I don't think that this worked. The government continued to make its phosphate mine. And I added this slide about climate change, mostly at Gu Beibei's suggestion, because I know that we tend here in the West to be very interested in China's people's response to climate change. And so there is to some extent, a group like Greenpeace will do a certain amount of consciousness raising about climate change. But so often my students say, I want to write a paper on the climate movement in China. And I'm like, guess what? I think you wanted to do that, Lucas, didn't you? Yeah. There's so many more urgent, right in your face issues. So if you can't breathe, if there's giant particles in your air and your child can't go outside to play, and there's cadmium in your rice and all these kinds of issues, then climate change feels like it's a little bit abstract, a little bit removed. And so the Chinese government actually understands very clearly the urgency of dealing with climate change. And the Chinese government has committed to peaking coal by 2030, and they've already reduced the amount of so-called dirty coal. They're leaders in renewables. bringing back all this nasty hydro, it's bringing back lots of nuclear, all this stuff. But your ordinary people are less concerned about climate change, I would argue, than the government leaders for those reasons. Okay, information transparency, another environmental hero and Gu Beibei's boss, Ma Jun. Okay, so Ma Jun, very, very savvy guy. Pioneered, again, using social media. You can look online and you can click and you can find out exactly what's in the air in your city. And so this empowers the Chinese people. This is a country that loves secrecy, you know? And the fact that the Chinese people can find out just by clicking exactly what's in the air is outrageous. It's forced, you know, this giant wedge into information availability. And even more, the Chinese people are able to upload, they're able to take their own readings and then upload it in a kind of crowdsourcing effort to really find out what's in the air and the water. Now, this gets to Betsy's comment about accountability, and this is something that Gu Beibei's organization pioneered. So, you know, in the olden days, groups like Apple or Samsung or Lenovo, whatever, they would say, oh, well, we just deal with our direct suppliers, so we don't know, you know, what's happening along the supply chain. And so Gu Beibei made a campaign against Apple, forcing Apple to be accountable to all their suppliers all the way down. And as part of that, I believe this is actually like Gu Beibei's organization coming to talk to some of the subcontractors who are then begging IPE to do something about that. So IPE was the most recalcitrant as far as providing information of all of the electronics organizations that IPE worked with. And now they've turned around after enormous pressure and after suing them and meeting them in Cupertino and really doing some pretty heavy-duty pressure tactics. Apple is now getting some very good marks on this scorecard. More transparency politics. Cancer villages, most of you have heard of. These are villages where the cancer clusters are really bad, and they are often associated with cities that are manufacturing goods for export. So again, China, the government only acknowledged that there was such a phenomenon about 1.5 years ago. But now, you know, it's inescapable. Okay, so some more really new ideas here. First of all, the phenomenon of the celebrity is a new idea for China. You know, we've got, you know, Robert Redford and Leonardo DiCaprio, and these people are doing their environmental thing for a long time. But does everybody know who Yao Ming is? Basketball. Okay, so Yao Ming single-handedly, with the help of the international NGO Wild Aid, has been able to make it much, much less fashionable to eat shark fin. Single-handedly. So this is an amazing example of the power of social media. Yeah, some people in this room know a great deal about this campaign. So we still have a ways to go, but my understanding is that the price of shark fin has gone way down because there is no demand. And the fancy restaurant chains have all promised to take it off. Of course, there's all kinds of backroom deals, but still, it's really an encouraging development. Also, an unusual development is that some billionaires, like Alibaba's Jack Ma, has started to encourage their employees to take pollution readings, make available different pollution kits, and also has a foundation where they give money out for environmental grants. So this is again, a very unusual development. Okay, let's turn to the ordinary people now. So we mentioned that you can't say on the web, let's go get together over here and have a protest, but you can say, let's all get together over here and take a walk. So everybody started taking a walk. Here's a PX campaign, or this is an incinerator one. So this is taking a walk to fight against an incinerator. This is taking a walk to fight against some solar panels, because unfortunately, for those of us who love solar energy, the production of solar panels is not so clean. Here's a great taking a walk protest in Dalian. This was an anti-PX plant protest. And you can see that taking a walk became really quite alarming for the local government. And so in all of this, there's a special role for journalists. There's a special role for journalists. Chai Jing, a very famous journalist, independently wealthy, took it on herself to make a documentary that was shown last March for about 3 days, and there was something like, I want to say 500 million hits. Is that right, Beibei? Something like 500 million hits in just 3 days. And so people have calculated that that meant that something like 1 out of 5 people of China had seen the documentary, because you don't usually see it by yourself. You're going to see it with your family. So this was extraordinary. This is a very kind of anthropocentric documentary. She's mostly talking about her concern for her own unborn child, her interviews with other little children. Isn't this a nice fancy slide? Beibei made it for me. I want to give credit where credit is due. I wouldn't know how to do this, but these are some images, you know, from the film. And what's really interesting is that the film goes on to say, you know, she basically has calls to the people, stand up and do something. You know, when millions of everyday people say, no, I'm not satisfied, I don't want to wait, I will not sit back, I will stand up and do something right now, right here, right in this moment. That's pretty wild. And one of the things she mentioned in the film was the apps that Madrin's IPE has available for downloading air pollution data and for uploading your own readings. And that app just got overwhelmed after the film. So the Chinese people are empowered. Okay, this is the journalist who fought against the dam at Tiger Leaping Gorge. And I thought that this quote was kind of poignant. He says, as a journalist, I should be focused on writing a good report, but half of my effort is spent on considering how to get a story past the censors and the likelihood of punishment. And indeed, he was fired from his job at Southern Weekend eventually. So moving towards the end of this, one of the other big changes has been the new environmental law from the about a year ago it came into effect. And so for the first time, there's a bit of a sense that these environmental laws may actually be implemented. Maybe this implementation gap that we've been struggling with is starting to be closed. There's also, for the very first time, used to be the only way to bring a lawsuit was if your ducks died. So you're the one, you know, who experienced the tort. But whereas here, you know, if you're Greenpeace, you can sue on behalf of the people who experienced the tort. So now you're allowed to do that in China. It's just starting. It's underused. There have been only a few cases, but this is kind of cutting edge development. So here, this Taichung, Jiangsu chemical case, the polluters were fined, and this was brought by some NGOs. So that's really exciting. So just to finish up really this presentation, we should also consider more and more the impacts of China on the world stage and the response of the people elsewhere in the world who are feeling the impacts of Chinese investment. So there's, you know, whether it's minerals, timber, grain, hydropower, fossil fuels, all around the world, sometimes with somewhat unsavory governments. The Chinese are not so used to having to deal with communities and get community cooperation. They often tend to think that if the government agreed, then it's going to be fine. And they get really surprised when they go out and they start the mine and the people are not happy about it. So they're starting to learn. But there's been a tremendous amount of displacement of environmental harm. The Chinese are not logging anymore in the upper reaches of the Yangtze River because of floods there. And so that immediately affects places like Papua New Guinea, Eastern Russia, and so on and so forth. So here's some other examples of resistance by other people around the world. Here's a protest against a Chinese-funded dam in Cambodia. Here's an example of this new, where's Matt? This Nicaragua dam. And you can see that the people in Nicaragua are not so thrilled about the idea that a canal is going to be built all across their country. So I'm going to end with 3 images. You know, is this the future of China? Or is this the future of China? Or my new ending image, you know, this is, the people have kind of taken things into their own hands, and ironically are now growing some of their own vegetables on the balcony again, because they know what's in that soil and they know that they can trust what they grow themselves. That's a kind of, you know, moving away from the land to returning back to the land, sort of in your own self-defense. So that's my presentation today, and we have time for 15 minutes of questions, and I'll go back to my panda bear. So thank you very much.
Just use the mic, I guess. So I noticed that with ivory trade, hasn't been as much momentum in terms of like compared to the shark fin, and I'm just wondering what's going on behind that.
The ivory trade is such a painful issue. I think that the shark fin is a more limited commodity in some ways. It's a specific, it shows up in a specific, you got your expert, your shark fin expert sitting next to you. It's a specific dish, you know, it's a specific soup. Whereas ivory, you know, it kind of goes to the heart of Chinese culture. The appreciation for ivory carvings, if you've ever been to some museums and you see that the entire tusk is carved with all these really detailed things. And I think with ivory, it's also greatly complicated by the fact of Chinese investment in Africa. So there are big scale projects in Africa that brought a whole bunch of workers with them to Africa to build roads or whatever. Those small scale workers are in the markets buying little bits of this, little bits of that. And then you have the alliance between the organized crime of the syndicates in Africa. I mean, I have understood that the Lord's Resistance Army is funded by the ivory trade, and the Chinese mafias are involved. And so you hear about entire container ships or containers full of ivory with something innocuous on the top. So it's all about payoffs and bribes, and it's at a scale that you and I, you know, can hardly fathom. The other problem with all of these trades is it really relies on the skill of the customs officials who are inspecting these things. And if a customs official doesn't really understand that this is important, then they're just going to let it go. And so I think that we have a ways to go still with this elephant thing, even though it's terrible. Somebody else, yes.
Thanks so much for that presentation. That was really great. My question is, you said before that 30 years ago you could never fathom just how much China would change. So in 30 years from now, that'll be 2046. It'll be rounding 2050. We have these climate goals going towards then and environmental projections. And I'm wondering if you have optimism in that regard.
Yeah, I'm actually a little bit optimistic. I feel as if China has to deal with these problems. They have to. They have no choice. They must deal with these problems. B, there's a lot of innovation going on. What did I see just 2 days ago? Something about hydrogen power and enough hydrogen power to get the world off fossil fuels forever, and it's only like 10 years away from being ready to implement. So, I mean, I think that the technological optimists among us may find some support in what's going on in terms of research in China. I also think that if we harness the preoccupation with face, the Chinese don't want to just like slog along behind the rest of the world. They want to like leapfrog. They want to leapfrog. They want to leapfrog. I take my ballet class today. Should I take ballet? I have to give a talk. Yes, I will. So they want to leapfrog and show that they can come up with another model. And so they're calling it things like ecological civilization and the Chinese dream and, you know, all of these things. But I think that there's innovation there. Now, I'm much less optimistic about biodiversity because that goes to the question of habitat. And there's just too darn many people who want that land. So, yeah, habitat for biodiversity is going to be really rough. And the food thing is very entrenched. It's going to be very hard to persuade the Chinese people that, you know, not eating a tiger bone is really going to be okay. You really, it's okay for you to turn down that tiger bone medicine because that's deep in the culture. I'm going to go this side. Anybody on this side? Okay, back to that side. Questions? Comments? Okay.
I just kind of anecdotally, I taught in Beijing for 3 years on China Agricultural University campus, and I taught environmentalism, and we inaugurated Earth Day, and there was, a lot of energy in terms of celebrating the Earth. But I also wanted to comment that one of my students founded an organization called Go Green, and it's now getting press in CCTV because she's been collaborating with a former PRC member who's doing this radical reforestation. So I was just wondering if in fact, and with APEC Blue and all that, that somehow, do you think that there's kind of like a mainstreaming? I know there's a lot of social media activity, but do you think that eventually the kind of narrative will get picked up by CCTV just by virtue of public pressure and get spun? Yeah, right.
I think that there's been space for the media to explore these environmental issues for a long time. It's a much freer space than if you're researching Falun Gong or Tibet or democracy or any of those words that would immediately get you censored. So we were talking about this in one of my classes, though, yesterday. The Chinese state is a complex entity, and so there are bureaucracies within the Chinese state that are as green as you can be, and you look at the quotations from some of those ministers and you think, wow, China really gets it. But then there's going to be other bureaucracies that are fighting for other kinds of things, and there's still also tremendous pressure on the government to keep everyone employed. So that's the deal. We were talking about this also in class. After the Cultural Revolution, after Mao died, the party basically said to the people, look, we know we screwed up, but if you let us stay in power, we'll raise your standard of living. And that's the deal that they carved out. So it's a really, really fine line because, okay, our standard of living is going up, but we can't breathe. But they can't just say, okay, let's shut down these factories either. So, but yeah, no, I think that here's the other risk. That narrative the environmental narrative can get co-opted and used to carry out political repression. So we see this phrase, ecological migration, for example, where, James Scott always says the state hates nomads because they're not legible, they can't be taxed, you don't know where they are. The Chinese state has been trying to make these nomads move into cities for a long time, for centuries. Well, finally, they have something that they can pin on the nomads. Too many goats, too many cows. You guys are ripping up the grasslands. It's your fault. Everybody move into the city, sit down, and we'll keep track of you. So that's called ecological migration. But it's actually forcible resettlement in the name of environmental protection. I want to keep an eye on that. I don't like that. Okay. Yeah, on this side.
Hi, thank you. This is very interesting. I just came back from a conference last week in San Francisco of the clean tech entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and so on. They're all excited about China because China knows they have a problem and now they have the money to do something about it. So I'm curious to know what has been your view about American entrepreneurs or European entrepreneurs coming with their new ideas that the Chinese are eager to gobble up. Do they fare well, and what's been the nature of connections with state-owned enterprises or private enterprises?
My impressions are a little bit dated, but I know that my impression has been that the US is behind the Europeans and that the Germans are really there. The Germans are in there. The Germans are, we have all this technology transfer problem, right?
Israelis, Japanese, and Americans now.
Okay. But we have a lot of intellectual property issues which I think impede the transfer of clean technology more sometimes than they need to. And I think that the Germans are doing a little better with that for whatever reason. But you're the expert, not me. On that. Oh, no, I mean, but the thing, the China, they build, operate, transfer, operate, what's that thing, BOT, whatever that is. So basically the problem is that so often you go in with a joint venture and the Chinese just learn how it's made, they learn how to do it, they crack the code or whatever, and then you're out of there and they have the technology. And so there is that dynamic that occurs as well. But I'm not an expert.
Thanks, Judy. I have a quick question. Chem China just bought Syngenta, which is the largest producer of chemical pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, for an enormous amount. It kind of blew out the whole ag economy scene globally. So there's the issue of pollutants in the food system, but in terms of inputs, deliberate usage of various chemical inputs, is there a public or a civil society response or a desire for more low input or organic agriculture, food products?
Yeah, this is one of the things that some of the small-scale civil groups are doing, is they're going from household to household to try to educate farmers that more inputs isn't necessarily good. Because if you're not a well-educated farmer, you're just going to think more fertilizer, it has to be good, right? You just pour it on there, and then that's all that runoff and all of that. So there is definitely an organic agriculture movement, but that's that defensive movement because people are so scared of what they're buying in the public places. A lot of labeling is a terrible problem, though. Call it organic, but then it's full of cadmium, So that's why people are. When I was this Hunan trip that I made maybe 2 years ago now, I ran into some people I'd known 30 years ago, and they said, "Well, let us go to the countryside," and they drove me 3 hours into the countryside to the home of a peasant whom they trusted, and they bought like a month's worth of whatever from that peasant and brought it back home again. But I saw with my little eye that right next door to that peasant was some kind of like plastic bag factory. So who knows what's in the fields. So it's really, really hard to know what you're getting. And so this big purchase, did they buy plants that are operating in this country, or they're going to be operating them here? Originally
a European country,
yeah.
Has big offices, but it's the largest in the world.
Well, I just showed a film in my class the other day called The Warriors of Chogang, which is about a fertilizer and pesticide factory in a cancer village, and these poor villagers are trying to get it closed, and their party secretary is being paid off by the factory, and they go to the local Environmental Protection Bureau, and they're under reorganization, and they're threatened, if you go to Beijing, we're going to beat you up, and on and on and on. It's so hard to get justice at the local level. So, yes. I think just time for one more, and then we get to have a reception. So.
Hi, Professor.
Yes.
I noticed that you mentioned the Greenpeace in China, and I believe they did some work and collect some data from the experiment farm to investigate the pollution in China. But some Chinese people think that they are like the spy organizations, like they're collecting the secret data from China and send to the send abroad. So do you think there's any way or solutions can deal with these kind of issues?
Yeah, okay, so she says that Greenpeace, a lot of Chinese people think Greenpeace is some kind of spy organization. Well, congratulations to the Chinese government for making you think that, It's not, I would not call it a spy organization myself. I'm hoping that more and more young people throughout the world will think of themselves as not China versus the rest of the world, but, all of us citizens from whatever country working together to try to find some solutions, and that Greenpeace has the expertise. They can send stuff to a lab where the lab is first rate and really find out. If the chemical is not dangerous in their finding, they're not going to launch a detox campaign. They'll only launch the detox campaign if, in fact, it's really dangerous for people's health. But it is true that these foreign environmental NGOs have a very difficult time operating in China precisely because of this kind of propaganda that you seem to have heard, that they may be some kind of spy organization. So, all right, on that note, again, thank you. They've made some nice food for us. I'm really grateful that you all came, and thank you very much. Thank you.
I saw you tweeted it. I thought, how nice.